Chosen one, stop for a moment and listen carefully. There is a reason this message found you at a time when you may be questioning what comes next. You may have spent months, or even years, wondering why certain things did not happen when you expected them to happen. You watched opportunities disappear. You watched people leave. You prayed about situations that seemed to remain completely unchanged. And somewhere along the way, you may have started asking yourself a painful question: was I waiting for something that was never coming? But what if the silence was not the end of your story? What if there was something you could not see yet, because the chapter you were standing in was not supposed to reveal the whole story? That is what makes this moment different. The thing God may have been keeping hidden was not necessarily a single event, a specific person, or one dramatic miracle. It may have been the purpose behind everything you were becoming while you were waiting. And now, you may be entering a season where the pieces begin to make sense. Your next chapter may not look like a slightly improved version of your old life. It may require you to see yourself differently, because the title of this message says something very specific. God kept this hidden. Until now, that means there was a reason for the delay. There was a reason. You did not know everything. There was a reason some answers came late, and there may have been a reason certain doors refused to open, even when you were convinced they were exactly what you needed. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you called something a loss, only to realize later that it protected you? How many times did you think you were being rejected when perhaps you were simply being redirected? How many times did you ask, "Why isn't this happening?" without realizing that another question was waiting underneath it? What is this season preparing me to understand? This is where your next chapter begins, not necessarily with something appearing in front of you, but with something becoming clear inside you, because sometimes the first sign that a new chapter is beginning is not that your circumstances suddenly change. It is that your relationship with your old circumstances changes. You stop begging for what once consumed you. You stop chasing explanations from people who could never give them to you. You stop trying to reopen doors that repeatedly closed. And slowly, almost quietly, something changes. You begin to realize, I don't want to go back anymore. That realization can be more important than you think, because a new chapter cannot fully begin while your heart is still trying to live inside the previous one. And perhaps that is why you had to experience the waiting. Perhaps the hidden part was not only what was coming, perhaps the hidden part was who you were becoming before it arrived. Stay with this message, because there is another layer to this. You may think the unbelievable part of your next chapter is what you are going to receive, but the deeper revelation may be that you are finally going to understand why you could not receive it earlier. That difference matters, because if something arrives before you are ready to carry it, you may lose what you prayed for simply because you were still operating from the mindset of the previous chapter. So perhaps the delay was not punishment. Perhaps it was preparation, not a guarantee of a specific future event, but a season in which you were learning patience, discernment, boundaries, courage, and trust. And if you look closely at your past, you may notice something. The things that hurt you also taught you what you will no longer tolerate. The disappointments taught you what truly matters. The silence forced you to listen differently. The closed doors forced you to stop depending on doors. And the moments when nobody understood you may have pushed you to understand yourself more deeply. This does not mean every painful event was sent by God. Pain is real, loss is real, disappointment is real, but faith can allow you to believe that even what you did not choose can still become part of what you learn from. And that is where the hidden chapter begins to reveal itself. Maybe you have been looking for a sign outside yourself. Maybe you have been waiting for one unmistakable event. But what if the first sign is the fact that you no longer feel attached to the life you once begged to keep? What if you are becoming peaceful about something that used to keep you awake? What if you are finally able to say, if God has something different for me. I'm willing to let go of what no longer fits. That is not giving up. That is surrendering the need to control every detail, and there is a huge difference. If this describes something you have been experiencing, you can write in the comments, "I am ready for the new chapter." Not as a magical formula, but as a personal declaration that you are willing to move forward instead of constantly looking backward, because there is something else you need to understand. Your next chapter may already be developing. Before you can recognize its full shape, a seed does not look like a tree. A beginning rarely resembles the finished story, and sometimes the earliest stage of transformation looks almost exactly like nothing is happening. That is why the hidden period can be so difficult. You cannot celebrate what you cannot yet see. You cannot explain what has not yet become clear. You cannot always convince yourself that the waiting has meaning, but that does not mean the waiting is meaningless. And this is where we need to go deeper, because if God kept something hidden until now, the obvious question is, why now? Why this moment? Why this season? Why after everything you have already been through? The answer may have less to do with a date on a calendar and more to do with your readiness to recognize what is in front of you, because sometimes the opportunity was not hidden, your understanding of it was. Sometimes the door was not invisible, you simply were not ready to walk through it. Sometimes the answer was present, in a different form. You were looking for one thing while life was quietly teaching you another, and that is why your next chapter may surprise you. You have been expecting the story to continue in the same direction, but what if the direction changes? What if the thing you thought was the destination was only preparation? What if the ending you cried over was actually the boundary between two completely different chapters? You do not have to know every detail yet. You only need to recognize that the previous chapter does not have authority over the next one. Your past can explain you. It does not have to define you. Your waiting can teach you. It does not have to imprison you. And your disappointments can shape your wisdom. They do not have to become your identity. So before we go further, remember this. The hidden thing may not simply be something God is about to give you. It may be an understanding you were not capable of carrying before. And once you understand that, the events of your past begin to look different, because the question is no longer, why did I lose so much? The question becomes, what did I learn that I could not have learned any other way? And the answer to that question is going to lead us into the next part of this message, because your waiting season had a story. Chosen one, there is something about waiting that people rarely talk about. Waiting does not only test your patience, it tests the story you have been telling yourself about your life. When everything happens quickly, you can easily believe you are in control. You make a plan, you work toward it, you expect a result, and when the result comes, you assume the path was obvious. But when nothing happens for a long time, the illusion of control begins to disappear. You are forced to sit with questions that cannot be answered immediately. Why did this relationship end? Why did that opportunity disappear? Why did the plan fail? Why did the door close after you prayed so hard for it to open? And perhaps the hardest question of all, why did God allow me to wait this long? There is no simple answer to every painful experience, but there is a perspective that can change how you carry the unanswered parts. Sometimes you understand a season only after you leave it. While you are inside it, all you can see is confusion. Later, you can see the connection. That is why you should be careful about judging your entire story from one chapter. Imagine reading a book and becoming angry because one chapter ends with everything going wrong. You would not throw the book away and declare the entire story meaningless. You would turn the page. But in real life, we often treat difficult chapters as if they are permanent conclusions. That may be what happened to you. A closed door became proof that your future was closed. A delay became proof that you had been forgotten. A disappointment became proof that you were not meant for anything better. but those conclusions may have been made from incomplete information. You were looking at one page, you could not see the next one, and perhaps this is what God was keeping hidden. Not because you were being denied, but because seeing the entire road at once might have changed the way you walked it. There are moments when knowing too much too early can become its own burden. If you knew every disappointment ahead, would you still have the courage to begin? If you knew exactly how long the process would take, would you have remained faithful to your growth? If you knew that certain people would eventually leave, would you have loved them differently? If you knew that one plan would fail, would you have allowed yourself to discover another? Sometimes the unknown protects the process. You are allowed to move forward one step at a time, and that is important because your next chapter may not be revealed as one giant announcement. It may unfold through a series of small changes, a conversation that gives you clarity, an opportunity that feels strangely aligned with who you have become, a sudden desire to learn something new, a renewed sense of peace, a decision to finally stop repeating an old pattern, a realization that you deserve healthier boundaries, a willingness to walk away without needing revenge or an explanation. These things may appear ordinary, but together they can represent something significant. You are no longer the same person who entered the previous chapter, and that changes what the next chapter can become. Think about the version of yourself from a few years ago. Would that person recognize your priorities today? Would they understand what you now value? Would they tolerate the same treatment? Would they chase the same approval? Would they define success in the same way? Maybe not. And that is evidence of growth, not perfection. Growth. You do not need to become flawless before beginning again. You need to become honest. Honest about what no longer works. Honest about what you actually want. Honest about what you are willing to release. And honest about the fact that sometimes the life you keep asking God to restore is not the life you were meant to return to. That can be difficult to accept, because familiarity feels safe, even when it hurts. You may know how to survive the old chapter. You may not yet know how to live in the new one. That uncertainty can make you want to go backward, but going backward simply because the future is unfamiliar can keep you attached to something that has already finished. This is why the hidden period matters. You were learning to separate familiarity from destiny. You were learning that just because something feels comfortable does not mean it is right. You were learning that a closed door does not automatically mean failure. Sometimes it simply means not this way. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: you do not need to force what requires constant forcing. There are things worth working for. There are goals that demand discipline. But there are also situations where the only reason you keep trying is because you are afraid to accept that they have ended. Knowing the difference is wisdom, and maybe that wisdom is part of what has been developing in you. If there is something you are finally learning to release, you can share it in the comments with one word, not the whole story, just one word. Fear, control, approval. Yesterday. Whatever represents what you are leaving behind, because your next chapter needs space. You cannot fill every empty space with something from the past, and then wonder why nothing new has room to enter. And now we are getting closer to the real meaning behind the title. God kept this hidden until now. What does until now actually mean? It means there comes a point when waiting stops being only about endurance. It becomes about recognition. You begin noticing what you previously overlooked. You begin hearing what you previously ignored. You begin understanding why certain lessons kept repeating, and suddenly, something clicks. You realize, I have been asking for the next chapter while still trying to preserve the previous one. That realization can change everything, because the next chapter may require a different version of your choices, different relationships, different priorities, different standards, different courage. Maybe you once accepted crumbs because you were afraid of having nothing. Now you would rather have nothing than keep betraying yourself for temporary comfort. Maybe you once needed everyone to understand you. Now you can move forward without convincing everyone. Maybe you once thought being chosen meant being noticed by everybody. Now you understand that purpose does not require constant applause. That is a major shift. And perhaps this is why the next chapter feels unbelievable. Not because every day will suddenly become perfect, but because you will experience life from a different internal position. You will no longer interpret every setback as a prophecy of failure. You will no longer treat every delay as evidence that your life is behind. You will learn to ask better questions instead of, "Why is this happening to me?" You begin asking, "What is this teaching me?" Instead of, "When will everything change?" You ask, "What can I change today?" Instead of, "Why did they leave?" you ask, "What kind of relationships do I want to build now?" Those questions lead somewhere, and that is where the hidden chapter begins to become visible. But there is still one important piece missing. If the next chapter is beginning, what should you actually look for? What changes should make you realize that you are moving into something new? That is where we go next. Because the signs may not look the way you expect. There is a point in every transition where the old life has lost its power, but the new life has not fully appeared. That space can feel strange. You are no longer who you were, but you do not yet know exactly who you are becoming. You may feel restless. You may feel unusually reflective. You may find yourself questioning decisions that once seemed obvious. You may suddenly want simplicity. You may lose interest in things that once consumed your attention. You may become less impressed by appearances and more interested in peace. These changes can feel confusing, but they can also be signs that your internal world is shifting. And this matters because the next chapter often begins internally before it becomes visible externally. Think about a sunrise. The sun does not suddenly appear at full brightness. There is first a subtle change in the darkness. The horizon begins to change. Then the light increases. Then you realize morning has already begun. Your life can work the same way. The first signs of a new chapter may be subtle. You may wake up one morning and realize you are no longer angry about something that happened years ago. You may hear a person's name and feel nothing. You may remember an old dream and feel ready to pursue it again. You may finally recognize that the rejection that devastated you also redirected you towards something more aligned. You may stop asking for the past to return. That is significant because one of the strongest indicators that you are ready for something new is your ability to release your demand that the old thing become new again. You cannot transform the past by staring at it. You can only carry its lessons forward. And perhaps that is the hidden preparation. You were not simply waiting for circumstances to change. You were learning how to respond differently when they did. Imagine being handed an opportunity today that you prayed for 5 years ago. Would the old version of you handle it the same way? Maybe you would have accepted it immediately. Maybe you would have ignored warning signs because you were desperate. Maybe you would have sacrificed your peace to keep it. Maybe you would have allowed someone else's approval to determine whether you believed you deserved it. But after everything you have experienced, perhaps you would make a different decision now. That is growth, and that is why timing matters. Sometimes the thing you ask for is not the only thing that needs to change. You need to change too. Not because you were inadequate, but because different seasons require different strengths. The person who survives one chapter may not be the person who can build the next one. You learned endurance. Now you may need discernment. You learned how to hold on. Now you may need to learn when to let go. You learned how to survive uncertainty. Now you may need to learn how to receive without fear, and receiving can be difficult for people who have spent a long time fighting for everything. When you have been disappointed repeatedly, Good news can make you suspicious. When you have been abandoned, consistency can feel unfamiliar. When you have lived in survival mode, peace can almost feel boring. This is why the next chapter may require adjustment. You may have to learn that not every good thing is a trap. Not every opportunity will disappear. Not every person will repeat the behavior of someone from your past. Not every closed door will lead to another loss. Your history can teach you caution, but it should not force you to expect disaster forever. This is one of the deeper revelations of your next chapter. You may have spent so much time protecting yourself from what happened before that you forgot to make room for what could happen next. And now, perhaps, you are being invited to make room, not blindly, not recklessly, but intentionally. Make room for healthier relationships. Make room for meaningful work. Make room for learning. Make room for rest. Make room for purpose. Make room for a version of yourself that is not constantly trying to prove its worth. Because your worth does not begin when something good happens, and it does not disappear when something goes wrong. That is a truth worth carrying into every chapter. Now, there is another sign that deserves attention. You may begin experiencing a strange separation between who you used to be and who you are becoming. People who knew the old version of you may not understand your decisions anymore. They may say, "You have changed," and perhaps you have. That does not automatically mean you have become cold. Sometimes becoming healthier looks like becoming less available for chaos. Sometimes becoming wiser looks like becoming quieter. Sometimes maturity looks like no longer arguing about things you used to fight desperately to prove. You may find yourself choosing peace over the final word. That is not weakness. It is freedom. And this is where the title becomes even more powerful. God kept this hidden until now. Maybe what was hidden was not simply a future event. Maybe it was the realization that you no longer need to become someone else to enter your next chapter. You need to become more honest about who you are, your gifts, your values, your boundaries, your mistakes, your hopes, your faith, your fears, all of it. Because the next chapter cannot be built from a false version of yourself. You cannot keep pretending you want what everyone else wants. You cannot keep choosing what looks impressive while your inner life is exhausted. You cannot keep saying yes because you are afraid that saying no will make people leave. At some point, your life begins to reflect the decisions you are willing to make. And perhaps your next chapter is unbelievable precisely because your decisions are changing. You are becoming harder to manipulate, harder to distract, harder to convince that you should settle, not because you think you are better than anyone, but because you finally understand the cost of abandoning yourself. If you have noticed that your priorities are changing, tell me what changed first. Was it the people you allowed close? Your career, your faith, your boundaries, your definition of happiness? That reflection can reveal how far you have already come. Because sometimes you are waiting for a dramatic sign while your entire mindset has already changed. And there is one more thing. Do not assume that a new chapter means you will never struggle again. That is not the promise. A new chapter can still contain challenges. The difference is that you may meet those challenges with new wisdom. You may no longer collapse every time something goes wrong. You may no longer interpret difficulty as abandonment. You may understand that progress is not always comfortable. You may learn to keep walking without needing every step explained. That is maturity. That is faith. And perhaps that is what the hidden season was building, not a perfect life, a stronger foundation. Because if the next chapter is going to carry something meaningful, the foundation matters. And now we're approaching the deepest part of this message. There is one final question. If the hidden season was preparing you and the internal shift has already begun, what exactly are you supposed to do now? The answer is simpler than you may expect. You do not need to predict every event. You do not need to force every door. You do not need to decode every coincidence. You need to become available for the next right step, one step, then another, and another, because the future does not usually arrive as one giant moment. It is built through choices, and that leads us directly to the final revelation.